our next session, which this will be another cluster of 5 lightning talks around the theme of sustainable growth. And to moderate the session, I'm delighted to introduce my colleague from the World Bank, Maria Vagliasindi, who's a lead economist in the Infrastructure Chief Economist's office. Maria, over to you.
Maria, we cannot hear you.
Oh, we still can't hear you, Maria. We see you.
Maria, you seem to be muted.
The problem is that when you unmute, we still don't hear you, so there must be some other problem.
If you have your cell phone, can you please join audio on your cell phone?
So perhaps while Maria is doing that, I don't know if the first speaker knows who they are in the lineup, but maybe we could, Gigi, maybe we could get the presentation up and allow Maria to introduce, once she's able to come in after the first speaker. Would that be possible? Great, so it's Valentin Lindlacker. Valentin, if you could get us started, please, you have 5 minutes.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks to the organizers. I'm excited to present my research on digital infrastructure and local economic growth, where we investigate early internet in sub-Saharan Africa, and it's joint work with Moritz Goldberg, who is also a PhD in Munich. Next slide, please. So when the internet became available at very basic speeds in sub-Saharan Africa in the early 2000s, it not only came with high hopes for economic development, but also with high costs, and these costs led to high investments. These high investments were partly necessary as there was a lack of pre-existing digital infrastructure, such like a copper network. What's very interesting about our setting is that we are investigating internet availability, where adoption is rather low and uptake mainly comes from a few firms, and that we are in a setting where alternative ICT is lacking. So unlike in the developed world, the internet email communication that did not substitute fax machines. While the literature in the developed world is well developed on broadband internet and internet availability, it is still lacking for the developing countries, with a notable exception of Jordan Polson, but this literature is growing, as we have heard yesterday from Jonas. However, how we contribute to this literature is by being the first to investigate the extensive margin. So when internet becomes first available at very basic speeds in an environment where there's no mobile internet for developing countries and for sub-Saharan Africa. More generally speaking about the internet, we are as the penetration is low, we can show that even with a few adopters, the internet has growth effects. And as we investigate them at the town level, we can show that the internet must generate such spillover effects that these few adopters generate more aggregate growth. Next slide, please. So we state the research question: what is the effect of broadband internet availability on local economic growth in sub-Saharan Africa in the early 2000s, where we measure local economic growth with night-to-night satellite data. And to estimate a causal effect, we use a difference in difference model, where we use as a national exogenous shock the timing of the first generation of submarine cables, where you see the variation in the map on the right-hand side. And as treatment control group, we use towns' access to the national backbone. And here we focus on incidentally connected towns. So we are not focusing on the economic centers, but on rather small towns with an average population of 20 to 30,000 inhabitants, and how they are growing when they can serve the internet. Next slide, please. What we find is, in terms of light intensity, a 7% higher growth, which can be translated in economic terms to a 2 percentage point higher GDP growth. We can show that connected towns are becoming brighter, which is associated with the growth in their productivity. As we are investigating rather short-term effects of 3 years, as you see in the event study plot, in this period, we can roll out population growth. So our effect is purely of economic terms and not a pure migration effect. And lastly, we investigate as a mechanism, a shift in the industry structure where we find higher shares in manufacturing. Focusing a bit more on the event study, we see a parallel trends before the treatment and a rather smooth growth when internet becomes available. So we see that the growth is not coming directly via the connection, but it is growing year by year, so that we see that in this third year, we have a point estimate of around 0.15. Next slide, please. So to conclude, I've presented that internet availability increased economic growth by about 2 percentage points. We estimated this growth at the aggregate level in a low uptake environment. And we focused on incidentally connected towns, which are rather small. So to conclude with a policy advice, this shows that even that the high investments paid off, especially in the non-economic centers. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Valentin. I hope you can all hear me now. We can stick to the topic of infrastructure, the impact of infrastructure on structural transformation, but we move from internet to electricity, from sub-Saharan Africa to Brazil. Joe Janis is our senior economist from the World Bank. He will be next, and it's my pleasure to introduce his presentation.
Thanks, Maria. I'm happy to present the paper on electricity access and structural transformation, evidence from Brazil, electrification. This is a paper with 3 colleagues, Fidel Perez Sebastian, Joseph Ferres, and Jan Trotter. Next slide, please. So here is my elevator pitch on this paper. So the big question we're trying to figure out is how the power infrastructure investments affect economic activity. I think everyone recognizes that the infrastructure investments are good. Question is how good they are in terms of the infrastructure multiplier. It's also unclear how large the effect will be on the structure of the economy and the transition from agriculture to industry services. We think that Brazil is great for studying this because the country has gone through massive push on different types of infrastructure. The focus of this paper is on electricity infrastructure expansion. As you can see from 2 maps on the right-hand side of this slide, most of the expansion happened to northeast and the central west regions, which also undergone through massive industrialization. The electricity access has reached out to from nearly 50% in 70s to 100% in population coverage and 75% in territory coverage, as you can see from the slide in the bottom. And the electric power has expanded drastically over the same period by a factor of 10, and the hydropower most was of the expansion. Next slide, please. So how are we going to understand what was the impact of this? We are trying to go through 2 channels. We start with econometric analysis to pick up the key elasticities. These are the reduced form effects, and for this we are estimating panel regressions of electricity access on growth and sectoral GDP shares. Obviously, these things are endogenous, but there is a well-known instrumental variable from earlier studies which construct a hypothetical hydropower network exploiting the fact that most of the electricity is coming from hydropower, as shown in the last slide. With these reduced form elasticities constructed, we feed them into the dynamic general equilibrium model to generate baseline and the counterfactuals to see how electricity availability affects growth and structural transformation. The model has many salient and interesting features, of which the most important are the impact of electric power infrastructure on firm productivity, so positive spillover effects, reduction in firms' fixed and operational costs. This is one of the few papers where electric power infrastructure enters the model endogenously as part of the government investment problem, subject to otherwise competitive allocations. Next slide, please. Here we see the results of the study. If you look at the left-hand side of the slide, you will see that we find very strongly that electric power infrastructure has increased the share of services and led to reduction of agriculture and GDP in total value added. So 1% growth in electricity availability leads to 1.4% increase in services share. The model explains these results. The main result is coming from the fact that when we don't have power infrastructure, we have higher relative prices of production, so the result, the industry share is higher. When we bring infrastructure on board, the manufacturing sector and the agriculture sector become more efficient, but smaller in size. So a lot of factors are moving to redundant factors are moving to the service sector. Now, of course, if we run a counterfactual simulation where we reduce the government spending on infrastructure back in the 1970s, and we see a drastic result that in the absence of power infrastructure, GDP would have been 36% smaller, and sectoral GVA value is 20 to 37.5% lower. Next slide. So summarizing, we find that expansion of power infrastructure has an important effect. This is a new effect that hasn't been previously documented in the literature. We find that electric power infrastructure explains at least a fifth of Brazilian structural transformation process between 1970 and 2006, and accounts for 36% of the cumulative GDP increase over the same period. Productivity and lower entry costs were the key factors driving this process. Thank you so much, and next speaker, please.
Thank you very much, Jeff, for the very insightful result. These are really big results in terms of number, but it also shows that the type of different electrification policy really can affect, particularly the type of impact of GDP. We can now move from basic access. We have seen basic access of fixed internet, and now with grid electrification, to more sophisticated infrastructure. We stick to internet, but particularly through smartphone. And we hear the presentation that we will hear from Vivien, again from the World Bank, the Office of the Chief Economist of the Africa region. We stick to the demand side mechanism, which have been often underestimated. Vivien, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you, Maria. I want to thank the organizers for inviting us to share this work. So this is a collaborative work with World Bank staff and faculty from JMU, including Kalewa Braha, June Choi, Ju Kim, and Professor Morris Kugler. So next slide. So there's considerable promise, as you have seen in this conference and others, in many developing economies, including countries in the Africa region, that digital technologies could actually play a significant role in growth, in economic and social outcomes. However, there's still only limited understanding or evidence on the key channels or the mechanisms by which digital technologies actually play this role. And even the existing studies on the impact of digital technologies have focused predominantly on the supply side. That's mainly digital technologies as factors of production, either with respect to firms or structure change, growth, etc. So there's still a wide gap in evidence and understanding. So the key contribution in this study is basically trying to bring in, as Maria noted, the demand side, where we look at how digital technologies can actually affect outcomes by improving on market imperfections. In this case, price information asymmetry. So the key contribution is, as I've said, to look at the impact of digital technology on reducing price dispersion, reducing market imperfection, price information asymmetry, and hence contribute to improved competition and hence further improve firm outcomes. So, you know, in many African countries, price information asymmetry or market imperfection is a predominant feature of markets. So, you know, issues like market remoteness or missing or low quality infrastructure are predominant, particularly transport and communications. So digital technology could actually play, you know, substitute some of the key roles that traditional infrastructure plays. So that's what we're trying to look at. Next slide. With respect to the key method, the methodology, so Ethiopia introduced the 3G in 2008. And before 2008, 100% of the network was 2G. So we consider this to be a leap in terms of communications and introducing data-enabled smartphones, etc. So that's our treatment, and that provides for time and spatial variation. And the outcomes that we look at are markups, productivity, principally, but also waste and employment. We use difference in difference and triple difference in difference. So we estimate the overall impact, but in addition to that, we actually try to disentangle, because you know the source of competition could be different for firms. For example, for firms that export, the source of competition could be, you know, firms that export are exposed to a stiff competition from international trade, which is different from what local firms face. So since we're looking at local price information asymmetry, then we try to disentangle that impact by differentiating the impact of this 3G on local firms only and exporting firms separately, because you know the impact from competition is different. So we have two data sets, data and large and medium manufacturing industries, as well as data and household consumption expenditure surveys. So we match these two data sets. Next slide. Okay, so what are the key results? The key insights, the key results, firms operating in districts, or what it does was improve mobile broadband access, you know, show significant decline markups, 29%, and significant rise in productivity, 23%. And this is also consistent with the key channel, because expanding mobile broadband boosts competition mainly by reducing price dispersion that we've seen, and enhance information. So price dispersion is lower after the introduction of 3G mobile broadband. We see stronger effects for domestic firms, that's firms that are not exporting, which is important to disentangle it from the competition that exporting firms actually face. So this is kind of a suggestive evidence that digital technologies, you know, could address some market imperfection issues. So could substitute for some of this missing or low quality infrastructure that we see in many African countries. Next slide. So conclusions, policy recommendations. So the key takeaway from this study that there are key questions about whether, you know, big questions about whether digital technologies are just like other infrastructure, roads, etc., or are they different? This study shows that digital technologies could actually substitute for, you know, other infrastructure, particularly when those kinds of infrastructure are missing, as we've seen in many African countries. And that has actually important policy implications. Because in many African countries, market remoteness or poor connectivity, either transport, other infrastructures, basically a defining feature of markets, and digital technologies could actually reduce the cost of this remoteness. Another important point that we can take away from this is that these findings could suggest the impact or the spillovers of digital technologies might actually be underestimated because of these wide gaps in our evidence that we have in terms of how or the channels of how digital technologies actually affect outcomes. So digital technologies could also be, you know, filling for the scarcity of other types of infrastructure, as we've seen. So an important point is that future research could actually focus on the relation between digital technologies and these mechanisms, price information, market power, and issues like that. Thank you. I'm sure that was very quick.
Thank you very much, Ubet. It was an exciting presentation that showed us where really where fixed broadband communication can be limited, as in many of our countries, more innovative type of innovation can really take the place, and particularly worth noting the impact that can be even on smaller city that usually is under considered. So thank you very much. Let us consider in the last round of few papers also externality connected to infrastructure, which allow us to expand the concept of growth from economic to environmental sustainability, and in particular, deforestation. The next presentation is by Jeffrey Pagel from the LSE, and he will actually tell us, examining what might be the trade-off. The floor is yours.
Okay, so thank you very much for having me. Today I'm going to talk about community-driven development programs and deforestation in the Philippines. And I am currently a postdoc at the LSE. Next slide, please. Okay, so the motivation for this paper comes from the environmental side and development. So on the environmental aspect, would be deforestation as a global concern. So just between 2006 and 2015, deforestation accounted for about 6% of global anthropogenic carbon emissions. On the development side, large multilaterals and international organizations are using or targeting CDD programs as a strategy for climate change mitigation and adaptation. So this is a type of program that just seeks to involve communities in the local development decision-making process and has been characterized as a movement of responsibility over resources and planning decisions. But there's very little evidence connecting these two. What are the environmental impacts that CDDs are having? So in general, we don't know very much about the effects that foreign aid has on deforestation, and more specifically, what is the effect that CDDs have on deforestation? And so that's what I'm going to do in this paper, is I'm going to ask whether CDDs have an effect on deforestation. So there's some related literature. So the closest paper, I guess, would be that of Hess and others, who are analyzing a CDD program in rural Gambia. And they find that there's spillover effects into surrounding villages. So there's some major differences between the two studies. So the first would be the scale. In the Philippines, we have several thousand, so around 5,000 projects that were implemented. In the Gambian context, this is around a couple hundred. Second would be the nature of these sub-projects. So in the Gambian context, they're more related to agricultural projects. And in the Philippines context, they're much more infrastructure-based. And second, I'm going to exploit two different time periods and two different empirical strategies. Next slide, please. Okay, so there's going to be two empirical strategies that I will exploit. The first is a regression discontinuity design in the first wave of the program from 2003 to 2008. So how municipalities were selected for this program was they were first ranked according to a poverty mapping methodology. And then the CDD program was restricted to the poorest 25% of municipalities within a province. So I'll exploit municipalities on either side of this threshold. In a later wave of the program, I will exploit a randomized control trial. So municipalities were randomly selected to be treated or controlled. They use this poverty mapping methodology again, and municipalities with poverty levels between 34 and 69% were randomly selected to participate in this program. And deforestation data, I will use the standard Landsat satellites, and they have pixel resolution of 30 meters squared. Next slide, please. Okay, so the main findings of this paper is I find that the CDD program has large and statistically significant effects on deforestation. So in the RDD program, I find eligible municipalities experience 220% more deforestation relative to the control. This accounts for about 79 hectares per year, around 44,000 hectares over the course of the first wave. In the second wave in the RCT, I find that treated municipalities experience 126% more deforestation relative to the control. And this is equivalent to 78 hectares, or around 23,000 across the second wave. So after I prove this link between a CDD and its effect on deforestation, I then look at potential mechanisms that could be underlying this result. And really, there's a story of economic expansion that this program has led to. So in general, I find that the program led to a poverty reduction, as was expected. And then in terms of economic expansion, I show that the program led to increases in nighttime light, as well as sectoral changes in agriculture, fishing, and forestry, and in manufacturing. I also look at spillover effects, and I find that in both periods, deforestation increases by 14 to 20% into surrounding municipalities. And then lastly, I look at corollary effects based off of the different types of sub-projects that were implemented by the municipalities. And I find that the largest impacts are coming from economic support projects and infrastructure projects. Next slide, please. Okay, so then there's several policy recommendations that can be taken from this paper. So I review internal documents of the program, and there's really two areas that can be targeted from from this program. So the first would be environmental safeguard policies. So safeguard policies regarding forestry and natural habitats should be included in the limited number of environmental assessments that were performed. Second would be monitoring and evaluating impacts that are coming from certain sub-projects. So in the heterogeneity, I show that different sub-projects have different effects and resources could be allocated differently to monitor certain infrastructure projects relative to other ones. And second would be in the implementation and support. So one could be to revise the technical manuals to include topics in sustainable development. And the second would be to train community facilitators in environmental sustainable building practices, which then could be transmitted into these communities. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Jeff, for the very important presentation, which reminds us of trade-offs, potential trade-offs between different programs and their impact on social and environmental sustainability and ways to mitigate it ultimately. The final dimension that we will look is once again related to social sustainability. In many instances, affected community oppose planned infrastructure project. And let me give the floor to Ulrich Hebert, who's examined this aspect in the case of dams. Ulrich, the floor is yours.
Very good. Thank you, Maria. My name is Ulrich Eberle. I'm a postdoc with Princeton University. I'm very honored to present my paper on infrastructure and conflict today. Next slide, please. So to start with, what is the link between infrastructure and conflict? Because after all, governments spend good money on building expensive bridges, roads, and dams in order to facilitate economic growth and trade to generate wealth. This wealth generated through infrastructure, however, is not necessarily spread evenly across space. And so, for example, if the government decides to build an airport in your backyard, there will be negative externalities for you in the form of pollution. Probably the value of your land is going to decrease. And, we see that kind of negative impact on local communities quite systematically throughout across global regions, as well as different types of infrastructures, and they often relate to displacement, poverty, and environmental burden. And despite numerous case studies, where we know that these protests can turn violent, there is very little quantitative work on this topic. And just to give you an idea, there are plenty of cases from Southeast Asia, but also other regions where protests have turned violent, where governments or militaries fight against local communities, as well as militias fighting governments. And this paper is really meant to shed some light on that issue, to understand the driving forces, and also look into the policies to build conflict-free dams. And the reason why I focus in this paper on dams is simply because with the green transition, we will more and more increase on dams. Today already, they provide a substantial amount of electricity and play an important part in food systems through irrigation systems. Next slide, please. So this paper looks at the local impact of dams and specifically into conflict dynamics. As I pointed out, that it's usually the people that are directly affected suffer the highest burden. It's a panel analysis that covers the whole world, which is for that kind of infrastructure assessment, I think quite interesting, as it allows me to look into different institutional features across national boundaries. The baseline employs an IV. I also look into an event study to better understand the timing of conflict onset. And generally, there is a empirical difficulty when measuring the impact of dams on conflict, is that dams are not placed randomly. They tend to be placed in regions that are economically thriving and safer. And to overcome that issue, I followed Duflo and Pandey that developed a IV strategy that uses the change in river gradient to predict dam placement. Next slide, please. So to give you an example, dams are much more suitable in regions where you have a very steep change in elevation. That is good for irrigation dams. good for hydropower dams, as well as in moderately steep gradients where water can be easily directed from, for example, the reservoir to the irrigation facilities. And shown here, looking within countries, you can see that areas with a higher share of suitable river gradient, shown here in darker colors, generally see more dams. And I exploit that predictive power of the river gradient to instrument for endogenous dam placement. Next slide, please. And so the findings are that on average, newly completed dam causes substantial conflict. This result is very robust as well. Looking closer into the details, my baseline coefficient still holds true for conflict events involving up to 50 fatalities. That is in line with the case study evidence. Further, I show that it's mostly about intrastate conflict dynamics. So as pointed out earlier, local communities or local militias being involved in these disputes. And I also quantify the baseline estimate with an outlook on the dams that are built over the next decade. And it shows that, you know, if we see a pattern continuing in the future.
I'm sorry, you might need to wrap up. Sorry.
Yeah, so we see a substantial amount of increase in conflict that is more developed in regions that are ethnically polarized and where political competition is low. What can be done in financial institutions can impose transboundary water treaties and impose conflict resolution mechanisms to curb violence. So the summary is that not that all dams are bad. It really depends on governance and international organizations as they have the tool to build peaceful dams. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. This concludes the final cluster of the lightning talk. Please join me in thanking all the panelists for their inspirational presentation and audience. And the word is back to Vivien. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Maria, and to all the panelists for another dazzling set of papers. Very interesting. Well, we've reached the final session of this conference, and it's my pleasure to moderate the final featured paper for today. The author is Luke Milsom from the University of Oxford. And while most of the studies that we've been looking at today have focused on economic dimensions of infrastructure impact on jobs, on growth, on trade, this looks at the issue of human capital. How do roads affect the formation of human capital in West Africa? And not only human capital, but also the inequalities in human capital formation. So Luke, over to you. You have no more than 20 minutes, please.
Thank you so much, Vivien, and thanks so much for the organizers for having my paper here. This is really a really exciting opportunity. Thanks everyone also for staying for the last talk just before lunch. I'll try to make it snappy and engaging. And thanks also, actually, just as a beginner, to Dave Donaldson and his kind of keynote speech here, because that's going to cover some of in a much better way than I could, a lot of the kind of methodological points that I'm developing and I'm building on. Sorry here. Okay, so without any further ado, let's get straight into it. Sorry. So I start with the observation that opportunity is unequally distributed across space, and we know this from various papers now, starting with the kind of seminal work by Chetty and others at the Opportunity Insights Lab in the US, but we also know this in a developing country setting. And here I'm showing you a map of 3 countries that I'm going to be focusing on in this paper. Mali, Cameroon, and Benin, where I'm plotting for you the distribution of opportunity in each of these countries. And I create this data in this earlier work of mine. But let's be kind of precise here, because opportunity means kind of many things to many people. When I say opportunity, what I'm talking about is the causal effect of spending an additional year of childhood in a given location on the probability of completing primary education. Now, in the setting that I'm discussing, we have kind of a good justification for thinking that this is actually kind of consummate with an opportunity more broadly defined. You know, having primary education is the most salient margin of education in the setting. it's highly predictive of not working in agriculture or having higher wealth, etc. But if you'd rather just think of opportunity as I'm discussing it as a more narrowly defined, kind of local access to education, then that's also fine. Okay, so opportunities are unequally distributed across space. What should we do about this as a policymaker or as a government? Well, previously, the literature has considered moving people to areas of higher opportunity, but there are a couple of issues associated with this approach. First off, it's difficult to think of how this could be scalable. It's one thing to move a few families from an area of low opportunity to an area of high opportunity. It's quite another to think of moving whole neighborhoods. In addition, there are going to be general equilibrium effects. If we're moving a lot of people, we're going to be changing the opportunity in different areas. We're going to be affecting the spatial distribution of economic activity and pricing, etc. It may also not be welfare maximizing. People don't want to move for a reason. They like being close to their family, their friends, their jobs, and a neighborhood that they're familiar with. So this paper is instead going to look at the alternatives of whether we can move opportunity to people. And in particular, I'm going to be asking the research question in this presentation: can policymakers shape the spatial distribution of opportunity through changing the connectivity of place? And in particular, I'm going to be considering this connectivity in road building. So can we move the opportunity to the spatial distribution opportunity through building roads? In terms of setting the data, I'm not going to have much time to go into this in any detail, but I'm going to be looking at Benin, Cameroon, and Mali from 1970 to about the present day. In terms of data, I'm going to be digitizing historical Michelin roadmaps. So sadly, Kong Peng's very interesting talk earlier on AI, kind of digitization of maps. Sadly, that kind of data doesn't go back far enough for me here, so I have to do it by hand, as well as the opportunity data from my earlier work that I showed you on the first slide, and kind of more standard data sources such as census data and DHS data. So how am I going to go about answering this question? And this is where the kind of close ties with what Dave Donaldson said in the keynote kind of come up. So my first step is that there are two steps to this problem. The first step is I want to find the causal effect of road building on the distribution of opportunity, as I discussed before. But there are a couple of kind of hurdles that one has to overcome to do this. First, it matters what's at the other end of a road. If I'm building a road from a regional city to the primate city, this is quite a different matter to whether I'm building it from a regional city to a less populated area. There are general equilibrium reflection effects that again they've kind of summarized very well. Any road is going to change the whole network, and this is going to change prices and also reflection effects. Lastly, not all roads are the same. So in my data, I can distinguish between different types of roads and look at road upgrading. And so, it's not just a matter of being connected or not. It's kind of the strength of that connection is also very important and potentially kind of essential or endogenous degree of heterogeneity. And then fourthly, and more kind of traditionally, there's going to be issues surrounding the endogeneity of road placement. We don't believe roads are built randomly. So yeah, as I was saying, in order to kind of capture the first 3 points, exactly as Dave was saying, I'm going to be developing a theory-driven sufficient statistic result, which is going to be consummate with a broad class of spatial economics models. And these models are going to exhibit costly migration as well as costly movement of goods over space. And I'll get into some more details of that in a few slides. And to overcome the second part, I'm going to be using a somewhat novel not-on-leaf cost path identification strategy, which builds on the identification strategies that some people have already used in this conference. The second step, which I'm not going to be able to talk about today, is more of this. Once we have the kind of causal estimates, how do we quantify the welfare impact of potential future projects? How do we understand the main mechanisms, and how do we decompose or study the changes in inequality due to road building over space? And to do this, I'm going to have to take more of a solid stance and write down a full model, as a few of the other papers today have already described. Okay, so let's build up this sufficient statistic result. And as a high-level overview of the main point to take away from this approach is that changes in connectivity are going to change the access a location has to markets, whether that be goods markets, whether that be markets, whether that be labor markets, and also this is going to change across sectors, whether you're educated or not educated. This is then going to influence the wages, the local wages that are on offer in a location, and this is going to influence the incentives to educate. And this is due to various factors. I'm going to focus on how changes in the returns to education are going to be affecting the incentives to educate. But you can also think of this more broadly as changes, as potential wealth effects, as potential opportunity cost of educating, and also as the cost of educating might change due to the government altering where it provides schools. And this is going to influence the opportunity on offer in a location, as I described it before, because it's going to change the propensity of individuals to complete primary education if they grow up in a given location. To go into a little bit more detail, on the left-hand side here, I have a kind of schematic overview of this modeling approach, where I have just 4 locations connected via roads that are displayed by these red lines with associated costs of transporting between them, and with trade flows as denoted by the X. So for the time being, let's focus on the goods side of the economy. This approach builds on a kind of broad set of assumptions that, as I said, can be rationalized by various data generating processes, such as a Ricardian trade model or an Armington type approach, and as well as others. So I'm going to consider a few assumptions. One is there are iceberg trade costs, which I guess which means that a proportion of the good is going to melt during transit as you move it between 2 places. We're going to assume there's a constant elasticity aggregate demand, and the main reason for this assumption is, well, I mean, there are many reasons, but we need to have some kind of incentive to trade across locations. So this means this generates a kind of love of variety of goods that are being produced in different places. These two, along with Shepard's lemma, which you may or may not, in my case, more likely not, remember from coursework in economics, if you're fortunate to take it. But this gives us a classic gravity model for trade, where the trade in goods between 2 locations is increasing is decreasing in the cost of trading between 2 locations and increasing in the size. This is going to give us, along with a goods market clearing condition, which is just that income equals spending equals the sum of imports, this equation at the bottom here, which is just that the total output in a location is going to be increasing in the market access, that is the kind of demand for products from this location, and decreasing in the kind of cost of the goods from this. So to this broad kind of general framework, I'm going to set up a symmetric labor market side to this setup, which is going to give a symmetric equation to this one at the bottom here. So this relates outputs to market access terms. The symmetric version in the labor market relates employment to labor market access, as well as increasing in the kind of location-specific utility being offered. I assume that W equals wages are equal to the kind of total output divided by total workforce, which just means that labor is the only factor of production here. But again, this can be generalized to have intermediate goods, to have land, etc. And it's not going to kind of break the core logic of what I'm saying here. And this gives me the market access and labor market access in, again, exactly the same way that Dave was saying, as a kind of, which is a very kind of similar but more general result to the Morton and Oliveira paper that he also cited, that these are sufficient statistics for changes in wages. I'm going to extend this framework by adding 2 sectors/types, that is educated and not educated, do you or don't you have primary education, as well as an education sector, which is going to, the demand for education is going to be increasing in the return to education, as I said before, but it also could be increasing in wages or decreasing in the opportunity cost of education. And then the supply of education, where a central planner is going to be choosing where to build schools. And yeah, this results in this sufficient statistic equation at the bottom here, which is that mu, which I'm calling my kind of opportunity measure, which was on those maps I showed you right in the first slide, is just the log linear function of these 4 market access terms. So the goods market access in E and N type, and the labor market access in E and N type also. Okay, so that's how the kind of the theory, appealing to theory, but keeping it as general as I can, gives us a kind of empirical specification. And again, this overcomes the kind of issues that Dave was saying, so I don't have to go into them in detail, or I think it gives a good motivation. But then we still have the issue that roads are built for endogenous reasons, right? Either to serve rapidly growing areas or galvanize flagging ones. And this is an issue that's already been discussed at some length in this conference. So in my case, it's challenging for me to use known instrumental variable strategies, and so I'm going to be combining the faraway variation idea that, and this is just the idea that roads that are built far away from a given location are less likely to be built for reasons endogenous to it, and then combining this with a kind of iteratively more likely to be exogenous variation by allowing by kind of trying to approximate what the central planner is doing and thinking about kind of increasingly sophisticated ways that they might be deciding to build roads. So to explain this briefly, I'm going to focus on this figure. So this is a figure where there's a 4-location economy. The black lines indicate the connections between locations, and I'm just going to focus on location 1 as the kind of focal location. So a faraway variation strategy would draw a red circle around a location like I've done here and freeze the road network within that circle, only using variation in the roads that happen outside of that circle in order to instrument for the change in market access in that location. A knock-on least cost path identification strategy builds on that by also freezing the variation in roads from the focal location along the least cost path to any other location. So that is, if I'm, as a central planner, building a road in order to make it easier to travel from that location to any other location, I'm no longer going to be using that variation in market access in order to calculate changes in one's market access due to changes in the road network. I mean, what variation is left? Well, this is now the indirect changes. So this is going to be variation in how market access of location 2, 3, and 4 in this example are changing due to the road network, and then I'm going to be using that variation to indirectly measure changes in one's market access term. However, this still has some endogeneity issues. For example, if a central planner is building a road between locations 3 and 4 here, in order to improve the outcomes in location 1, perhaps to ease congestion, or perhaps to stimulate trade in 4 and therefore improve trade to 1, this is still going to be a threat to my strategy. In order to overcome this, I can iterate this. I can use second order, not on least cost path variation. And here denoted, here I've tried to kind of visualize this. So as well as freezing the direct variation along the least cost path from 1 to all other locations, I'm also going to be freezing the road network, the least cost path from all other locations to other locations. And what this is going to do is mean that now I'm only going to be using the indirect variation due to changes in the road in market access on second order locations, to then use that variation to measure changes in the focal locations market access. And what this allows me to do is not use is to not use any variation that might be due to indirect changes in the road network, such as what I described, as they might connect locations 3 and 4 in order to ease congestion to 1. But again, we might think that a central planner is particularly sophisticated, and actually they're building a road between A and B in order to improve C's outcomes, in order to improve D's outcomes. And now if we believe in this story, this would still be a threat to this identification strategy. But we can just iterate again, and so on. I mean, obviously the instruments are going to become weak after a stage, and indeed I find they become weak after about 4 kind of degrees of separation. But what this allows me to do is gives me a kind of ranking of different instruments where you think they use increasingly likely to be exogenous variation. And so if coefficients stabilize, we have some kind of evidence to suggest that there's no more, or there are fewer issues on this dimension in terms of endogeneity. So in terms of results, when I do this specification, so we have this graph on the right here. I'm showing the coefficient on each type of market access term, as I described in the equation that was generated from the theory. On the x-axis, I'm showing you different identification strategies. So the most left-hand side one is the OLS, and the most right-hand side one is the kind of strictest form of variation. I've colored in the dots if they're significant at the 5% level, but you can also see the confidence bands. What we take from this is that a few things. Firstly, the coefficients stabilize after about second order least squares path variation. So this gives us some evidence to suggest that we've eliminated issues around endogeneity on this front. Second thing to note is that the coefficients are in line with what we would intuitively expect from the theory. And indeed, I can show you kind of, write down mathematically exactly what we would expect from the theory. That, for example, the coefficient on N-type labor market access is positive. And why is this? Well, it's because if you increase N-type labor market access, you're going to be putting downward pressure on N-type, that is not educated wages, which are going to be increasing the return to education. And so we would exactly expect that is going to increase the propensity to educate in an area, which is consonant with my measure of opportunity. We can also see that the results are somewhat significant. In fact, I'm underplaying the significance here because I can combine the last three instruments to make much considerably more efficient estimates that show actually quite tightly estimated results. And yeah, there's a little kind of addendum there if you're familiar with the Boursiak and Hull kind of endogenous exposure to exogenous variation correction. These results are robust to correcting for that. Okay, so just to summarize, in this paper, I'm using kind of digitized historical maps and local causal place effects data, bringing in a kind of a theory implied empirical specification where I'm trying to keep as broad as possible in terms of the set of data generating processes or set of models that are consistent with this empirical specification. It was a somewhat novel identification strategy, and the main takeaway from this part of the paper that I've shown you today is that road building does offer a direct policy instrument that can alter the spatial distribution of opportunity in Benin, Cameroon, and Mali. The next steps is to look at counterfactuals and welfare considerations and the impact of road building on the inequality of opportunity, as well as heterogeneity between the three admittedly very kind of heterogeneous countries. And I think this is there are some interesting results there that I don't have time to show you. And also ask where it might be best to build roads next. And this is exactly the kind of questions that I want to be able to answer. Thank you very much. I think I'm almost exactly on time.
Wonderful, Luke. Thank you so much for sharing that interesting paper. So we have time, I think, for a couple of questions. So we have a question about the mechanism of what's going on here. You kind of said at the beginning that one option was to move the people to the opportunities and the other was to move the opportunities to the people. So what is the underlying mechanism here? Is it that people are actually moving to cities when the roads improve and they're getting higher wages there? Or is it that the remote places that are being connected have more vibrant economies and are creating opportunities there? So it wasn't very clear like what's going on. I'm going to give you all the questions at once and then you can tackle them as you will. The other question is around while your paper is, first and foremost about education, in the process of getting there, you had to actually do a lot of labor market analysis and you have a lot of, I think, results about wages as well. So I feel like we can get two sets of insights from your work, but I wanted to try and understand, what the two stories would be. And finally, clearly you put a lot of thought into the strategy for dealing with endogeneity. And it was a little different. I hadn't come across this before. I'm more familiar with the inconsequential treatment type of approach that was mentioned by Dave. And I think a couple of the other authors have used that. Some of the simpler kind of straight line or topography or pseudo networks. How would you kind of compare your approach with some of these other approaches? And do you think that it's somehow offering something additional that others should be following as well? So those are the questions. Thanks.
Thank you so much. These are really great questions. So let's I'll take each of them in turn and try to do them justice. So on the first question, is it kind of are people moving to cities, or is it that some areas are becoming more vibrant? So what I try to do by looking at the kind of causal effect of place on opportunity, I try to kind of to pass out or condition on the possibility that people are moving, that kind of people are selecting into areas where market access is increasing, for example, or where roads are building. And for that reason, I'm trying to mainly speak to the kind of second possibility, that areas are becoming more vibrant. But I would also caution that to say that at the moment, the results I've shown you are more about a kind of relative things, right? So an area that gets improved market access of one type might get better, but at the moment I'm making a relative statement. So it's not necessarily the case that kind of to go back to what Dave said, it could be more of a kind of zero something, right? That some areas are getting better at the expense of others. And indeed, I can look at the kind of a loss of heterogeneity over space, and we see that for some areas it's really important that if you're a hinterland area, it might be a kind of a brain drain argument, if you will, that actually the kind of people are moving away from it, and you're maybe specializing in agriculture, which gets a bit to what Nicholas was saying also in his talk. On the other front, the kind of labor markets education question, you're exactly right that a lot of the kind of mechanisms through which this is happening is changes in the kind of labor markets, changes in the wages being offered, and also in the sectoral composition across locations. And this is an area that I still want to kind of investigate more to see what exactly is happening on those fronts. I mean, but in a lot of the cases, the results are kind of somewhat mirroring what we're finding on the education side, exactly because there's this kind of close connect between the return to education in an area, which is some sectors are doing better than others, if you will, and the opportunity or the propensity to educate in the area. On the identification question, I think this is a really good question. So the reason why I'm using the approach that I am using is because it's difficult in my setting to implement an inconsequential units approach or something similar for a number of reasons. I mean, firstly, a lot of the roads, a lot of the changes in the transportation network over the time I'm looking at are actually road upgrading rather than new roads being built. And this is a big difference, going to a kind of large motorway from a smaller kind of track. But it means that it's kind of harder to think about whether, because units are kind of already treated before, so if they're inconsequential or not, it's kind of harder to imagine that. And in addition, it's harder to think about, because in order to use an inconsequential units approach, you have to have an idea of like two locations that are being connected. And it's hard to think of a kind of set of locations that are then being connected. And it's like, how would you define, if a big city is the intended target, or if a smaller city in between was the intended target, because they're already kind of large centers that had some sort of roads going through them. But I think I see my approach particularly as a kind of extension of the faraway variation, where faraway variation approaches are defined in terms of kind of a Euclidean distance across space, right? 20 kilometers away, 50 kilometers away, etc. Whereas this approach is more thinking, well, actually, if we take the kind of network seriously, then we should define distance in kind of terms in kind of network terms. And if you think about it like that, then this kind of indirect variation is exactly like kind of one degree of far away, but defined in terms of the network rather than in terms of directly across space. But I think there are synergies to using both of those approaches. Yeah, I think that was everything. Thank you.
Great, Luke. Thanks very much. That's very very helpful. So we have reached the end of our conference. I want to thank everybody who has made it such a rich program. I'd like to thank the participants who stuck with us to the end and showed a high level of engagement. I'd like to thank our speakers, our moderators for their rich contributions. And above all, I'd like to thank the IGC, who has been a fantastic partner for the organization of this conference. And I think bringing together the World Bank and IGC resources and perspectives and networks has really helped to make this conference very, very rich. So it only remains for me to reassure you that all of the sessions have been recorded, and we do have all the PowerPoint presentations, and these will be uploaded onto the conference website shortly. So you'll be able to peruse them at your leisure, should you wish to go back and look at any of the material in more depth. Thank you so much. We appreciate your participation, and we wish you a good day. Thank you. Bye-bye.